The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you all so much for joining us here on CPA Academy. This is Jason Bookman. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm so glad that you're all spending part of your day with us here on a ripped from the headlines, incredibly powerful topic, avoiding a data breach, preventing the problem you never want to have. And you are all in for a real treat. We have Darren Guccione from Keeper Security, who's going to be presenting for you over the next hour and a half. Hey, Darren, how you doing, man?
How are you?
Doing all right. And before we get into the webinar, I just want to do a couple of quick technical checks, a little bit of housekeeping, make sure everything's working for everyone. So those of you who haven't already done so, go ahead and pop open the GoToWebinar questions panel. Let me know that you can see us. Let me know that you can see the screen, the title card. And let me know that you can hear me as well. While you're in there, let me know where you're checking in from, what you're hoping to get out of today's webinar. And so far, I see people checking in from New Jersey, Dallas, Arizona, North Carolina, Arkansas. Welcome, everyone. So glad you're all spending part of your day with us here on CPA Academy. A little bit of housekeeping regarding credit for those of you who might be new. Today's webinar qualifies for 1.5 CPE credits, and in order to earn those 1.5 CPE credits, you have to be logged in for at least 75 minutes out of the 90 minutes of today's webinar and answer the poll questions. Polls will pop up periodically on your screen. You'll have about a minute or so to answer the poll question by clicking the little radio button next to the answer and then hitting the submit button. Please make sure you hit the submit button, otherwise the response will not be recorded and we will not be able to use that poll to issue you your CPE. We at CPA Academy are going to issue that CPE credit by the end of the day today. That'll be available in your CPA Academy accounts along with an archived recording of today's webinar and a copy of the handouts. Those of you who haven't already done so, go ahead over to the handout section. You'll be able to download a copy of the handouts to follow along with at home, reference back to in the future. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Darren Guccione from Keeper Security into today's webinar. So Darren, you're already up on the screen. Say hi to everyone. And
hello, everyone.
The floor is yours.
All right, that's great. I'll probably turn my camera off though for the balance of this. But hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about avoiding a data breach and preventing the problem that you never want to have, both at the firm level and at the client level. Just a little bit about me. I am a cybersecurity technologist. I started my career as a CPA. I do keep my CPE credits going, so 40 hours per year like clockwork. I have a Master's of Science in Accounting and Finance from DePaul University, a Bachelor's of Science in Industrial Mechanical Engineering from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So I've been a technologist now for roughly, I'd say 15 straight years. Prior to that, I did a lot of work in tax planning, tax preparation, real estate finance, due diligence, and did that for about 15 years prior to going into technology full time. So this is what I do, and I live, eat, and breathe cybersecurity, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you today about some of the things that we're going to discuss. So we'll move forward. So today I'm going to cover a few things about the cybersecurity industry, and we do a lot of work at our organization. I run a company called Keeper Security. Our headquarters are in Chicago. Just a little bit about us. We make the world's leading password manager and secure digital vault. We've got offices, about 4 offices now, both in US and Europe and also one in Asia. And we do a lot of work on thought leadership. And that would be a lot of surveys with small to medium-sized businesses, larger enterprise. We like to analyze security breaches. And one of the industries that we focus on, because hacking is so prevalent, is in the financial services industry, which is of course perfect for us as accountants and CPAs. So I'm going to talk a lot about the shocking statistics that we're seeing and why this is so important and what we can do to protect not just the accounting firm, but also the client information, given that we're all fiduciaries of that information. Next, I'm going to talk about survey statistics, the cyber threat landscape, data breaches by industry vertical. We're going to talk about identity and access management, which is a really important part of building a cybersecurity posture, a budget, and a system of internal controls at your firm to really protect and safeguard personal identifiable information for both your firm employees and your clients. and we'll talk about how to protect and do that. And then at the very end, we'll go into some Q&A, some questions and answers. I'll be happy to field any questions that you may have, and we'll do our best to cover everybody's questions, provided we have enough time to do that. So cybersecurity is a really big deal. And when I give a lot of keynotes and webinars like this, what I typically realize is that a lot of the firms out there today just don't understand how big this problem is. They do read headlines, as we all hear about these headlines, being more prevalent and pervasive, and it doesn't really matter how large or small the company is or what industry you're in, but it's always an issue. And cybersecurity is something that we need to learn more about. We need to educate ourselves about, because it's complex, and it's a complex problem that does have some practical solutions when it comes to technology. And a lot of firms out there don't really understand that, A, there's really strong technology that can help solve these problems and mitigate risk and exposure for the firm and its clients, and B, that you can get some cost-effective solutions in place fairly quickly to start making a big difference in averting a cyber breach. So right now, if you look at the landscape, 70% of all victims of a cyber attack or breach don't realize that they have hackers in their internal systems stealing information. And we call this a zero-day attack. And a zero-day attack is when you have hackers in your database or your network and you don't realize that they're there. And so zero-day starts on the first day that you realize that a hacker's in your system, and now you're faced with a challenge of how do you get them out. And one of the examples of this is Sony Pictures. That was a textbook zero-day attack where hackers had infiltrated their network for a period of up to 6 months and were stealing droves of financial and personal identifiable information, as well as other assets, intellectual property belonging to Sony. And this has happened over the course of time. And we're seeing this a lot with state-sponsored cyber terrorism and cyber hacking from countries like Russia and China. And we've seen this in order for countries to enhance the economies and get to scale much faster, because from their perspective, and they're right, I'm not saying ethically or morally they're right, but if you steal intellectual property, given that you're trying to build a world economy for your country, it's a lot easier to steal it than to figure out how to create it from scratch or invent it on your own. So zero-day attacks are really important. It's important to know that a lot of firms out there that have undergone a security breach don't realize that they're being breached as they sit here today. 47% of American adults have had their personal information exposed by hackers. That's a staggering number, and that number continues to increase. Even if you normalize out what happened with Equifax, which was a more pervasive breach that impacted upwards of 200 million people, if you normalize that out, it's still a gigantic number. And this is the problem. So 90% of all employee passwords can be cracked in 6 hours or less. And this is alarming, and it's a big problem. So traditionally what you'll see, and we're going to cover this in more detail today, is that employees quite often use memory or sticky notes or worksheets or Excel workbooks to track their passwords. And most often, they'll use a password that's too weak. In other words, the password doesn't contain a minimum of 8 characters. It doesn't contain letters, numbers, symbols, and special characters. And in fact, maybe like their first name or a digit like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or something really simple. And we can talk about the prevalence of commonly used passwords that are subject to data breaches. We've done a separate study on that, and I'm going to show that later. But in sum, most of the passwords are dictionaried by hackers. What that means is that they keep lists of the most commonly used passwords across a populace of users. And they know that a very large percentage of the time, they're going to be able, through their software, to crack your passwords. And most of them can do it in under 6 hours, and that's 90% of the time. So the solution for this, technically is use high-strength random passwords, and then make sure that there's a separate unique password for every website, application, and system that you use. And we're going to show you how to do that later. So there's something interesting about hacking, and most people may not realize this, but bad personal security does impact job security. So when a company is breached, especially an accounting firm or a financial services firm, depending on how large your firm is and how financially stable it is, within 6 months, 50% of all SMBs, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, if you're an SMB, that means a company with under 1,000 employees, 50% of those companies or firms that have been subject to a major security breach or data breach will go out of business in roughly 6 months. So hackers just last year cost the US 500,000 jobs. That is a staggering amount. So you can see, for example, in the Target breach that happened a few years back, there were people that had been with the company many, many years, and some of them, for example, at the CIO level or the C level and down into IT management or IT security, were out of a job, right? And so this is what you don't want to see, and you don't want to see a firm get toppled as a result of a major security breach, which then leads to either sanctions by a state under a statute, or a class action lawsuit by a group of clients. So every day, over 300,000 people are hacked. And again, some of them realize that they've been hacked, and some of them may not even realize that they've been hacked. And if you look at the number of websites that are hacked every day, 30,000 websites per day are breached. So these numbers are staggering, and they're not getting any better. They're getting worse and more serious. So this year alone, we talked a little bit about this earlier with Equifax, but normalizing out Equifax, 150 million Americans have been hacked this year alone. Again, big numbers. Hackers make big money on the dark web, and this is tens of billions of dollars now annually. And this is a very interesting thing. I went to federal court last year on a case as a cybersecurity expert, and this individual, low 20s, was living in the basement of his grandmother's house, had been hacking accounts, stealing people's personal identifiable information, and monetizing that on the dark web, stealing credit card information, monetizing that on the dark web as well. And at the end of the day, some of these hackers that are in their teens and early 20s are driving around in Ferraris, and their parents can't figure out what's going on. They're not dealing drugs or narcotics. They're actually hacking and reselling personal identifiable information on the dark web. And when you start looking at this, you ask, well, how much is your information really worth? The information here, which is interesting, is that a bank account, for instance, can fetch anywhere from $20 upwards of $1,000 for a single set of account credentials. PayPal, for instance, fetches between $20 and $200. A Social Security number used to be a lot more than $1. But what happened was with the Equifax breach and what happened there, the price on the dark web for Social Security, just given supply and demand, dropped. Driver's license credentials can go for $20, a credit card number, and keep in mind, like, if you run these, just generally speaking, if I'm a hacker and I can crack a database and take 1 million credit card numbers, think about the fact that I can now sell that for $5 million in Bitcoin, right? Or even $110 million in Bitcoin. These numbers are staggering, and they're happening. Passports go for anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 per unit, and medical records, which used to be more, We do see some medical records go up to 1,000 depending on who it is, but on average I'm seeing them about $300 right now on the dark web. And medical records are really great records to steal because most often they contain all of the PII, which we call a FOLS, and that is a complete record on an individual. So for example, it would include first name, last name, billing address, mailing address. It'll include your social security number, your date of birth. It will include your whole medical history, all of the medications that you're taking. The more pervasive that is, the more value it has. And then that information can be used over and over again to do things like create credit on behalf of a client, or for example, open up a credit card and do a litany of things with it. It can get monetized multiple times on the dark web. So when I look at information and how it proliferates across the dark web, one digital asset can be replicated and monetized many times over. So it's very potent. Next is that hackers cost companies over $445 billion this year, and that's what it's been already, and it's going to go up, and we're going to talk about why, and it has to do with the emergence and proliferation of enterprise cloud. And so when I say enterprise cloud, I don't mean cloud computing for larger enterprises. It's just sort of a catch-all phrase, and what we're talking about is the enterprise cloud and SMBs, accounting firms, clients, all migrating their information to the cloud. And when you migrate information to the cloud and you're using all types of web-based cloud services, the result is that the number of passwords that you need for each one of those increases. So now this problem is really an exponential one because more people are migrating, more people are now using weak passwords on multiple websites, or they're using the same password on multiple websites and services, knowing that those passwords are weak. Hackers have a field day with it. And so our analyses have shown in our studies that more than 60% of all people use the same password on multiple websites and systems. So if you're using and replicating weak passwords, you're exposing yourself to serious and material risk. So we take several surveys at Keeper, and this is a result of one of the workforce surveys that we did last year. And some of the stats are they're staggering. So of the populace, 81% of all breaches were due to weak password security, 81%. And this follows suit with the Verizon study that was done roughly a year ago. And the key here is that if you use weak passwords or poor password practices, like using the same password on multiple websites, etc., what happens is when you think about creating a cybersecurity framework and plan for your organization, if you don't have a good handle on your password security and you don't build strong internal controls and policies around passwords, then you're never going to have a good security strategy, because cybersecurity must always start with password security. So that is first and foremost of paramount importance. Next is that 70% of the workforce that we surveyed, they digitally share private information. And what the problem here is that when they share information, for example, if I'm on Slack or Skype or some other system like email, and I need the password to get into, let's say, a software or a tax software or an accounting software or a client's QuickBooks file, whatever the case may be, typically what we see is that those credentials are being shared in an unsecure format, unsecure. So what you always want to make sure of is that through software and technology, if you're going to share login credentials, which is very common, we all need to do it, it always needs to be shared vault to vault. That means with full end-to-end encryption and what we call zero knowledge, and we'll talk about zero knowledge security a bit later. 60% of the data set was not concerned with corporate security, 60%. And what we found was that they were more concerned about productivity. So this is an interesting one because security and productivity, which we can say ease of use, right? If you think about security software, the dilemma that you run into with security software is that typically it's very difficult to use. There's just this premise in somebody's mind that they say, oh my God, we have to use the security software and there's 6 steps to log in, and maybe I have to use, 3 different factors. It's a pain. I hate using it. It's a nightmare. What's happening today is that technology and productivity are unifying. They're converging, and you're seeing technologies that are easy to use, that actually are hyper secure, and they make you more productive at work. For example, a password management solution will bring those 2 facets together. Next, 50% of the populace use personal devices and apps at work. Now, this is really important because I can speak for myself, for example, and I'm looking at I've probably done upwards of 10,000 tax returns over the course of my life prior to going into tech full time. And I will tell you that most of the companies that we worked with were BYOD structured. And our company is BYOD structured. So for example, we don't own or control the personal devices that people use. So for example, we don't buy everybody smartphones here. People that come to work at our business, like most other companies today, they buy their own and have their own smartphones. And we know that because we don't own those devices, we're faced with a dilemma. We know that the employees, when they go home or when they're at lunch, right, or on the weekends, they're using their personal devices to transact business for the benefit of our company and our customers. So how do we capture that? How do we get a cloak of armor around devices and place governance on devices that we don't own? The answer is that technology exists that allows you to control the information as it pertains to your firm on those devices. It doesn't matter if you don't own the device. You can have the employee install software that's given to them free of charge that allows them to manage and access their passwords, private information, metadata, sensitive files, documents, photos, videos, whatever the case may be. You can place a ubiquitous digital vault on those devices as an employee benefit and a benefit to your organization and its stakeholders, including, of course, the client. And it's great technology and it exists. Next is that 45% of all employees that we surveyed change passwords only when requested. Now, there are certain industries that require password rotation every 30, 60, or 90 days. One example of that would be the real estate industry. So the National Association of Realtors require realtors, for instance, to rotate their MLS ID passwords, periodically, right? No less than 4 times a year. Now, you always want to make sure that, as a general business practice for good internal control, that you can rotate passwords regularly for key systems. For example, to your tax database, to your financial database, to source documentation for your clients, right? Copies of invoices, bank records, W-2s, other tax documentation. Any access to those systems, servers, and databases should be rotated no less than every 60 days. And again, there's technology that can automatically do the password rotations for you without you even having to worry about it. You can schedule that. Next is that 80% of the employees that we surveyed reuse passwords on multiple websites. And as we talked about, that's a big no-no. So it's taboo to use weak passwords. It's taboo to reuse weak passwords on multiple websites, because if a hacker can breach one site and they know that 80% of the time you reuse them, they can replicate those login credentials across those other systems, and 50% of the time they will be successful in achieving a breach of multiple accounts. So we're going to talk a little bit about cyber threats as they mount for SMBs. So this is from our Ponemon Institute study. So we just finished a survey of over 1,000 small to medium-sized businesses, and it was done with Dr. Larry Ponemon. We actually sponsored the Ponemon Institute study for the SMB State of Cybersecurity, and we do this every year, and we just finished our production yesterday, so this was just published literally yesterday. So some of the key stats from that were that 61% of all SMBs have suffered ransomware attacks in 2018, and 40% of small to medium-sized businesses were attacked through compromised employee passwords. Phishing, and it's of course not the fish icon that's there, but that was cute. I'm glad our designer did that. Phishing, which is the most common method used by hackers to steal passwords. So if I was to teach somebody how to hack, I would teach them how to phish. Phishing is like hacking 101. It is when you send an email to an unknown recipient, and they just, without realizing it, they open the email, it looks totally legit. Let's say it's from Citibank, it looks and feels like Citibank, it has the logo, everything looks beautiful, and the recipient fails to realize that the from to email address is not from a Citibank at all. It's malicious, and more often than not, unfortunately, employees click and transact with these phishing emails. So you may get an email inside of an organization and it says, we're Citibank, we need to confirm your, username and password for security purposes. Please click here to log in now. You don't realize that on the other end of that link is a hacker waiting to steal your login credentials, and unfortunately, this is a very successful method. It's low technology. It's very easy for them to do, and the number of phishing attacks is escalating today. So one of the things that we're going to recommend at the end in terms of protection from a cybersecurity perspective is to get phishing test software that you can run inside your own organization and educate your team about phishing and actually run phishing simulations against your employees to see who actually falls for it and who doesn't. And when they fall for it, it generates a report, and then you can take action to politely, and hopefully calmly sit down with your employees and teach them, you clicked on this, here's what happened, here's why you failed, here's what you have to look at. So it's really great technology to start using in a company, and we use it, of course, here as well. So there's a lot of noise out there, with what happened with Facebook and social media, and what's happened a lot with Google in terms of privacy. Okay, and I'm a believer that privacy isn't dying. I believe that privacy is totally dead. I absolutely believe that it's dead. In today's ecosystem and technology landscape, we have to win our privacy back. And the only way to do that effectively is with technology. And at the core of the technology, what you want to make sure of is that everything that you do when it comes to credentials, credential sharing, logging into a website, logging into a server, etc., is really easy to do, but also completely protected, what we call zero-knowledge security architecture and world-class encryption. Because without that, you will never be completely private. You will always have some risk, and I would say without encryption, your risk is massive, right? So if we go back to the Sony breach, there was a plain text document on one of the servers that was called passwords, and it was, I think, a Word document that had listed out a bunch of passwords for certain systems in plain text format. With a password management solution, right, and there's several out there, World-class encryption is required, and everything in that system, if it's zero knowledge, will be encrypted at rest and in transit, and will only let you as the employee have access to it. And it's very, very important that you start thinking about end-to-end encryption, not just with passwords, but with all sensitive information being transacted on or shared with a client or with an employee inside the business. So the threat landscape, what does it look like? What's happening? So this is what we see today, and this is, what we see proliferating for the next few years. Ransomware attacks are growing more than 350% annually, and this is big. And ransomware is a big problem because if you don't have protective technology against your network, like firewalls, intrusion detection, endpoint security setup, what happens is that a hacker can place software on your computers and literally lock them up and prevent you from getting access to your system, getting access to your computer, and in essence compel you to pay them a ransom in order for you to unlock use of that computer or gain access to your data, right? Or prevent them as a ransom from, displaying your personal identifiable information for your firm and its clients on the dark web. So ransomware attacks are very lucrative on the dark web and with the hacking community, so this one's on the rise. The next one is that 61% of all breach victims were businesses with under 1,000 employees. So the majority of breaches are at the SMB level. Now, if you think about small to medium-sized businesses, up until I would say the past few years, most technology companies in cyber were focused on selling to larger enterprises. That is, companies that have over 1,000 employees, they have more sophisticated budgets, right, that deal with the granularity of IT infrastructures and cybersecurity. They have IT infrastructure, right, personnel for managing systems and software like this. And at the end of the day, the largest part of the business population, which are SOHOs, small office, home office, and SMBs, were looked over. And that's not right, because it's the largest part of the business world. If you look at the number of SMBs in just the United States, there are 5 million of these companies, 5 million SMBs just in the US. There's 22 million in EMEA, that's Europe, Middle East, and Africa. There is a massive number, and if you look at the number of publicly traded companies or larger enterprise, it's a small fraction compared to the number and scale of SMBs out there. Now that doesn't include higher ed, non-for-profit, .gov, etc. So this is a huge, huge market that needs cybersecurity assistance. And there are now technologies out there that are priced right for SMBs. They're easy to manage. They don't require the SMB to have a formal budget for IT infrastructure or for security. You can put the amount on a credit card. It's amortized monthly. It's a digestible amount of money. And if you look at the cost to the value, the spread between those two things is absolutely massive. So it's a really great thing that we're seeing more technology come in to help SMBs. Next is that financial damages related to cybercrime are projected to hit $6 trillion annually in just a few years. That is just an incredible number. So this is big business, and it's really impactful on a lot of different levels. So if we look at the histogram by industry, and we spend a lot of time on this, and this is why we're talking today. I specifically love talking to the financial services industry, just being a CPA at the core, and loving technology, is that financial services is the most targeted. And it's the most targeted because that's where the payload is. You've got the payload with PII, so really strong personal identifiable information, lots of account numbers, lots of deposits, right, and balances that can be sifted and stolen. And then you've got fraudulent tax return reporting, which we've seen a lot of, where your client calls and says, I never got my tax refund, and it turned out that a hacker was able to get their login credentials, file a tax return on their behalf, and stole the 1040 easy refund. In a matter of 10 days, it was gone. And so this is really under attack. And then we see utilities and energy. Utilities and energy is a big one. Aerospace and defense, of course, technology and software, and healthcare as well. So you can see the histogram here and why it's really important as financial services professionals. We have to pay special attention to this because, what's happening is that if you sit back and we all look at ourselves and say, look, I'm a CPA and I'm collecting, personal identifiable information, tax and financial and all kinds of sensitive information, right? Because as an accountant, we know our clients more than anyone. They even tell us like their deepest and darkest secrets. We know if they're going through a divorce, if they're having personal problems. They tend to tell you everything, right? And so what you become is this trusted source, not just about computing numbers and generating results from a tax or planning perspective, but there's an incredible level of trust. And what that means is that they're looking at you as a fiduciary of that information. You have a fiduciary responsibility, as we all do now, to protect and safeguard that personal and financial information. And when you don't do it, it's now bigger than just losing the client or harming your reputation. It's sanctions, it's lawsuits, it's loss of a brand. It's a nightmare, right? And we'll get into what the costs of remediating a firm from a data breach is. And it's hitting in the millions of dollars for a smaller firm, maybe like a 2 or 3 person accounting firm. It's averaging almost $400,000 now to recover from a data breach, and that includes everything from a lot of litigation and remediation work and notifications and time and everything else. So it's quite arduous. Okay, so we've talked about the industry stats, and now we're going to talk about.
Hey, Darren?
Yes.
Sorry for jumping in. I know we're going slightly out of order, but is it okay if I launch a poll question right now?
Sure.
All right, we are going to launch a poll question right now. I would like to remind everybody who has asked for a poll question in the questions panel that yes, there are polls. They are issued at our discretion. We do not need reminding. Thank you all very much. We will have the polls out as soon as we are able, and now this poll is up. I, of course, also want to remind everyone who has questions for Darren regarding the subject matter, please make sure you drop those questions in the questions panel of GoToWebinar. We might have some time for an audience Q&A at the end, but for right now, this is poll question number 1. Darren, again, I apologize for going out of order. We wanted to make sure to get at least one in before we got really into everything.
Okay.
But we've covered a lot of really important ground so far, and we are close to having about 95% of our audience checking in. So I am going to go ahead and close this poll question down in 3, 2, and 1. That was poll question number 1. There will be 3 more poll questions throughout this webinar as we reach the hour and a half of our CPE time. So Darren, back to you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Jason. Okay, so we're going to talk about why is this happening. Well, all companies have a target on their back. So we've talked about this personal identifiable information. We call it PII. So they're a gold mine of that. And now by collecting this information, it's your responsibility. It's on all of us to keep it secure. And things have changed because this is now more prevalent than ever before. Everything is digital. When we had paper documents and files, it wasn't so easy to just break into an office and steal a bunch of documents. Now everything's being sucked up into the cloud. How do we protect it? How do we safeguard it? And we have to now embrace technology, because if we don't embrace technology, we're never going to survive. It's just not going to happen. It's moving at too fast of a speed. And we'll get into this. So we've covered this polling question. Jason beat me to it by about 3 minutes. So you've answered that. So we'll go to the next one. So Jason, do you want to cover this one?
Happy to. Let me go ahead and get poll question number 2 fired away, and everyone should be able to see that on your screen. This is poll question number 2. There will be 4 total poll questions, and of course I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Darren, please go ahead and ask them in the questions panel. We should have time for some audience questions as we get towards the end of the webinar. And of course, the quicker everyone votes on this poll, the quicker we will be able to get back to the presentation. So I'm going to leave this open for about 15 or 20 seconds longer. All right, we have just over 90% of our responses in. Let's see if we can get that number a little bit higher. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. And poll is closed. Darren, back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this question and why it's so important. If you sit back and you ask yourself, if you're, the head of your firm or a partner or a sole proprietor, it really doesn't matter. If you sit back and ask, wow, I'd like to get visibility on our company's password hygiene. I wonder if I know how many people inside my firm are using weak passwords on multiple websites, apps, or systems, or the same password on multiple websites, or maybe they're not using two-factor authentication, when they should be, or, they're not using a full end-to-end encryption solution. The answer 95% of the time, and we're working really hard to solve this problem, is that most SMBs don't know or have visibility over the password security at their business, and that's a problem because we need to know. And the more that we know, the more that we can take action to protect all of the endpoints in the company. That means every smartphone, tablet, and computer for every single employee at the business. So what's the real cost of a data breach? What actually happens and how is this measured? So we segment this down into, well, what happens at the client level and what happens at the firm level. So at the client level, their identity is stolen. Now, here's the issue. We're going to talk about different forms of identity. If you have your first name, last name, date of birth, and social security number, that information is going to be out there essentially forever, okay? If your fingerprint's stolen, okay, which happened in a government agency, that was the Office of Personnel Management, I think upwards of 25 or 30 million people's fingerprint identities were stolen. We know that you cannot change your biometric. You can't change your fingerprint. You cannot necessarily change your retina. Maybe with technology and major crazy surgery, yes, but for all intents and purposes, you cannot. So if you look at what happens if a password's stolen, no big deal, because password management technology allows you to rotate that password quickly and take action to protect yourself. So identity theft is a major issue because if identity is leaked from the client, to the client side, from the firm side, if there's a leak or a breach, the client knows that they're in trouble, and they're in trouble for an extended period of time. It could be into perpetuity depending on what's stolen. So you talked about, compromised biometrics, we've mentioned that, and then of course the loss of time. And this one is the painful one. It takes a tremendous amount of time to unwind the effects of a data breach at the client side. And I'm saying contacting banks, being on the phone, dealing with vendors. It's a process and it is a painful one. And if you have a pervasive breach where all of your email, social media, bank websites, a plethora of information is required to remediate, you're going to be pulling your hair out of your head. Next is the impact to the firm. So the firm has exposure beyond just PII on the client side. They have confidential trade secrets, and trade secrets are really important. How your firm's set up, your business plans, your financial projections, your marketing strategies, how you're going to grow, how you're going to compete, not just for your firm, but also for the clients, right? And so if you look at one of the biggest cases in history, where China had breached a company called Nortel, and Nortel's patents were sold several years ago for, I think, north of $1 billion, and they were split up between Google and Apple and Microsoft. There was a litany of companies that came in and bought this patent portfolio. But what happened there was China recognized many, many years ago, when most of their highways were dirt and they weren't using tractors to plow their fields, they were using bison and a plow, a physical manual plow with a person behind it, plowing a field. They knew that they wanted to be an economic superpower. And so if you sit back and say, okay, well, how are we going to do this? Like, how are we going to know what to invent? How are we going to license this technology from US companies and afford to do this and save ourselves 100 years? Because if we're talking about building highways and a transit system and building factories to produce state-of-the-art consumer goods, right, and all kinds of different technology, we're never going to be able to do it. So what they decided to do was to hack into networks of companies in the United States. One of those was Nortel. And there were stories, and you can go on the web and read about this yourself, where engineers from US companies were actually visiting some of these plants, and they were saying, oh my God, this factory looks really familiar. In fact, it's identical to ours. How did they do this? Well, it was really straightforward. They were able to steal confidential intellectual property from droves of US businesses that didn't realize they had infiltrated their networks, and they were stealing business plans, stealing information about how to build factories and heavy equipment, and how to build highways and transit systems, all kinds of different products. And think about it, if you have the blueprint for doing it, now you just need the money and the people, and they were able to state sponsor this and utilize that to their advantage to gain an economic advantage over other countries. So this is a big deal, and this is what we read about a lot today in terms of state-sponsored hacking. It's not just for the larger enterprise. They do it to smaller companies, and SMBs are ripe targets for this. Next is revenue. So if you're breached, I think we all agree that it's going to be disruptive to our business. We're going to lose clients, and it's going to adversely and materially impact our revenue. And next is brand trust. So brand trust with financial services is probably the most important with respect to any other industry out there. If you are a service provider and somebody places their trust in you as their CPA and advisor, and you violate that trust, for all intents and purposes, I think the relationship between the provider and the client is over. And so when a firm's brand trust is destroyed, typically the firm follows. It'll just be a matter of time before that firm folds and closes its doors. So we're going to talk about the 4 facets of cybersecurity. So when you sit back and hopefully, following this webinar, I'd love to sort of hear about inklings of people, huddling up in a conference room and saying, look, we really need to sit down and talk about our cybersecurity strategy, even if your firm is, 3 people or 3,000, it really doesn't matter. There's 4 buckets of cybersecurity that really, really just have to be implemented in a cybersecurity strategy. So when you start looking at technology solutions out there, you're going to see that there's really 4 categories of them. Number 1 is prevention. That's preventing a data breach. So how do we make sure through the use of technology and software that we can help mitigate the risk of a data breach? Because if we prevent it, then we don't have to worry about all of the pain and suffering that follows suit afterwards. Next, how do we detect it? So how do I know instantaneously, within like a matter of seconds, that an intruder is trying to attack one of our devices, one of our smartphones, tablets, computers? How is that endpoint security handled? How do we detect the breach? Now, let's say a hacker does get into your network and they're inside, and you realize they're inside. Whoa, we have hackers inside our network and they're stealing information. How do we get them out? How do we patch it? How do we remediate? That's remediation software. And then, of course, you have reporting. And there are states, different states have different requirements under their statutes that say if PII was stolen, right, depending on the state that you're in, you have a legal responsibility to report that breach within a specific period of time to a specific group of people. It could be your clients. In some cases, it could be the general public. But the bottom line is that you will have a reporting requirement, right? So it's not just to the outside, but to the inside. You want to make sure that it's generating the KPIs that you need, the key performance indicators with respect to, maybe password security or endpoint detection, confirming that everything's A-OK, your antivirus is up to date, your malware protection is up to date, all of that is up to snuff, and it's going to fit in one of these 4 buckets. And it starts with prevention, of course. So we're going to talk about identity and access management. And identity and access management is a very important, it's not a concept, it's a real thing. And it's part of the prevention prong that I showed you here in this slide, and it's right here. And identity and access management is making sure that the right people have access to the right resources and systems in your organization at the right time for the right reason. And what this really just like boils down to is something very simple. It's about protecting all of the digital assets across all of the systems and computing devices inside the organization, and making sure that you mitigate the insider threats situation. The inside threat, meaning a careless employee does something they shouldn't have and they put a post-it note, on the monitor of their computer with their password. Or they sent email, they emailed login credentials to a website to another employee, and that email system was hacked and now it's out there. Or somebody was accessing a server in your accounting firm that shouldn't have been there. They shouldn't have had access to that particular folder on that particular drive and shouldn't have been able to see the files that were there. This, as a total whole, is what identity and access management is all about. So what are the forms of identity and access management? Number 1 is a password management solution. It starts with passwords, and we've talked about that. Cybersecurity must start with password security. Next is multi-factor authentication. 2-factor authentication is really important. It's about having 2 factors, something that you know, which is your password, something that you are, and something that you are or something that you have. It could be your fingerprint, it could be your Face ID, it could be the use of a secure ID like an RSA secure ID key fob that generates like a 6-digit code. It could be a litany of things. There's a lot of multi-factor systems out there, and it's really important to make sure that you bolster security with 2-factor authentication on critical systems, because this is going to help mitigate the risk of an outside threat, meaning a remote breach from another country or another location outside your office. Next is an identity repository, and that's, of course, making sure that All of the PII for the employees and client information is held in a digital vault that's fully encrypted at rest, and when it's in transit, it's also encrypted. So full end-to-end encryption. And then there's provisioning software. So if you're a smaller firm, you probably won't use things like Active Directory or LDAP or an IDP like an identity provider, which we call single sign-on solutions. But larger firms may use systems like this. So when you get software, you want to make sure that the software that you're buying is really easy to provision and distribute to all of your employees on all of their devices. That's really important because it's a management issue. You don't want software that's very difficult and cumbersome to manage, right? It defeats the purpose. So again, we're talking about software solutions that are ubiquitous in terms of productivity, ease of use, and very secure. Next is security policy enforcement. And what this is about setting up and establishing roles, teams, and which people in your organization have rights and access to which files, how can they maintain records, which groups of folders do they have access to. So think about it like what you would build out in like Windows or Azure, that type of infrastructure. You can do the same thing and map those set infrastructures, roles, requirements, enforcement policies into a lot of the software and the technology that really covers the cyberspace. So next is reporting and monitoring, and that is about making sure that you have dashboards at your disposal. And dashboards are what we're going to look at every day to see how our systems are doing, making sure that our endpoints are tight, making sure that we have strong password security in the organization, and if there's any issues that are flagged, we can instantly respond to those, and we call that incident response. So we want to make sure that we can respond to any security incidences quickly and resolve them quickly and move forward. And the systems that are out there today are getting much easier to use. So I'm sure most of you know who this is, and this is the CIA operative who leaked information. And if privileged access was more potent at that time and being used at the government level, this would have helped thwart or prevent this type of issue, right? It's the inside threat where you have an errant employee at an organization that decides to steal information and give it to a third party without your consent. And this is what identity and access management also helps you prevent. Next is that identity and access management is essential for your business technology toolbox or toolkit. It really has to be part of the cybersecurity plan. So it allows you, to manage all of your client identities, your preferences, your profiles across all of those channels, all of those different endpoints. You can defend client privacy across location, hosting models, and partners. So a really good security solution will protect, you'll have a super user, you'll be able to see and work down in a hierarchy with good taxonomy to cover branches, offices, separate locations, separate teams, etc. So you can get really granular with it. And then you can get adaptive secure access to sensitive data for all employees and partners. So they'll have this ubiquitous digital vault that they can transact with you on. So for example, when you want to, provision a vault to a client, all they're going to do is drag and drop all of their tax records and financial information right into that folder. And the second they do that, you get a notification in your vault, everything's there, and you're not emailing documents back and forth. It's super easy, and it makes you, of course, more productive. Next is that it supports seamless mobile client experiences that really promote and engender a high level of trust between you and your client, because you are now working inside this digital vault and this full end-to-end encryption environment. You use identity data for boosting client relationships. Again, when they know that you care about their security and productivity and ease of use, they appreciate you for it even more. It helps them speed things up. It helps you aggregate the information that you need on any engagement, and it just helps, again, boost that client relationship through enhanced trust. Okay, next, it's interesting when we look at this, you see this Post-it note. It's amazing, like, how often we see this. Of course, not in our business because we're fastidious about security, but still today, you might open up a daily planner and have login credentials written down, or have a Post-it note somewhere, an access password for a general ledger document or a file. It's just, it's something that we keep seeing, and I scratch my head every time I keep seeing these come up in our studies. But the collection of corporate virtual private network passwords, usernames, operational details were found in a very large accounting firm. This is one of the big ones, and it was a public-facing GitHub hosted repository. GitHub is a repo that we use here for certain projects, and this was an interesting story. I won't list the name of the firm, but hackers got into the network by getting into the admin account without complex authentication. We have seen in hacking incidences where username and passwords were admin or admin 12345 as the password. And we're going to show you a study. We have 29 minutes left. I'm going to show you a quick study that we did, and it's unbelievable when you look at the results. So we've talked about cybersecurity starting with password security. It's absolutely the case. And how does identity and access management secure your passwords, right? So you can get a password manager. You want to have multi-factor authentication, and you want to have privileged access management. And so these are really the three cornerstones and facets that you want to make sure that you understand, because this is how IAM really covers it. And you can see here, for example, on this mobile device that's on the screen, this individual is using software, and this is Keeper actually, that has a bank account folder, credit card logins, everything's organized inside this vault. It runs on every smartphone, tablet, and computer that he has. And he's got even his alarm code in here, maybe his Amazon password, everything, every single thing that you could think of, an alarm code for the office, a file, a photo, a tax return, all of this is inside this ubiquitous digital vault, completely encrypted at rest, and it syncs with all of his other devices. And if he shares a record with the client, for example, the bank accounts record is definitely shared. You can see the sharing symbol right there in the folder. That is shared with the client. The client has access to it and only has access to that specific folder that's been relegated to that particular client. So very powerful. So what can you do today? So the first thing that you need to do is you have to establish really strong internal controls. You got to have a written policy. And I always say that if you don't have a written internal control policy, bringing in technology when you don't have internal controls really well documented and thought through, the technology should always follow the internal control process, not the other way around. So you want to make sure that you establish the control policies first. Doing an assessment like a SOC 2 Type 1 and Type 2 exam is awesome. We do one here every year. They're expensive, they're time consuming, but they're amazing. And they tell you what you're doing right, where the holes are, what you need to fill, any gaps, etc. And you want to make sure that, for SOC, which is a statement of controls through the AICPA, it basically analyzes how you secure and safeguard client information and information of all of your stakeholders. It's about security, it's about privacy, it's about internal controls and safeguards. It's not just, relegated to digital assets, but also how do you protect the hard physical assets and fixed assets at the organization. So it could cover everything from encryption to an alarm system at your organization. It covers the full gamut. So I would recommend that you do an assessment there. Next is that once you determine where the security gaps are, you should close them. And closing the security gaps is extremely critical because, you know, we always say it only takes one weak password to wreck a company. And it's absolutely the truth. It only takes one exposed data file to cause a huge problem. So closing the security gaps is critical. So how do we protect your firm and client information? So it's really a couple things, and it's really a mindset. You know, it's not like, you know, you can have a list of 10 different things. Once you get into it and you start doing some research on this and start thinking about it, you have to take identity and access management seriously. And this is where it starts. So the prevention prong, remember we talked about prevention, detection, remediation, and response or reporting. Prevention is number one of paramount importance. So you have to take that seriously. And you want to make sure to educate and train your employees. They understand the importance of cybersecurity and what the protective tactics are to avoid a data breach. We talked about phishing. We talked about good password hygiene and some of the other things that we've covered today. Really important to really engage in education. You know, run some, you know, your own internal seminars on this and really talk through this and run, you know, those simulations across the teams that you have. You'll be amazed at how beneficial it is and how many people will appreciate what you do for them in terms of the security of these applications. So here's the third polling question, Jason, if you'd like to read this one off.
Happy to. Let me go ahead and get this queued up. Poll question number 3, what is the biggest password-related pain point for your firm? And we're going to leave this open long enough to get a majority of responses in. There's been some really great questions that have come in over the last couple of minutes. And again, I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Darren, go ahead and, excuse me, ask them right here in the questions panel. So we're going to leave this poll question open long enough to get a majority of responses. There will be one more poll question after this one over the next 20 or so minutes of the allotted time for today's presentation. All right, we're getting close to 95% of our attendees reporting in, so I am going to get ready to close this poll down. And this poll will close in 3, 2, and 1. All right, Darren, back to you.
Okay, so I'm just going to cover the question a little bit and just talk through this for a couple minutes or just maybe a minute. But what is the biggest password-related pain point for your firm? So resetting passwords, changing passwords when an employee leaves their job, using, you know, weak passwords as we've talked about on multiple websites, systems, and applications, employee passwords being stolen or compromised, or none of the above. And chances are, we all experience these pain points. Passwords are a pain in the butt, period. They're difficult to deal with, they're cumbersome, everyone has their own way of doing it, some weak, some strong, some better than others, but most often it's time consuming, it's weak, it's insecure, and it's a problem, and it's exposing too many companies to data breaches. And this is why password management exists today. Okay, here's the next polling question, Jason. So Jason, did you want to cover this one, or I lost him? Okay, well, I'll read this one off. So polling question number 4.
I apologize, I had my mic off for a second and I did not realize it was off. We're going to go ahead and launch that poll now.
No problem.
All right, poll question number 4. Does your firm have internal controls and security policies for employee passwords? We're going to leave this open for, again, just long enough to get a majority of responses in. I apologize for the mic trouble there. I was trying to troubleshoot and had my head completely under my desk and was trying to figure out what was going on there. We're going to leave this open for just about another 10 seconds more. Again, this is the final poll question, so please make sure that you answer this poll to ensure the maximum number of opportunities to answer poll questions for CPE credit, and we are going to go ahead and get this poll closed down in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, Darren, back to you.
All right, thanks, Jason. Okay, so polling question number 4 was, does your firm have internal controls and security policies for employee passwords? So we talked about cybersecurity starts with password security, and it only takes 1 weak password to really seriously damage a firm. So this is really just the concept of the mindset, getting the mindset in place to say, wow, you know, if the answer to this question is no, we have some work to do. Okay, and so that is that's really it. And I'm going to actually cover a couple other things. I'm going to pull up another just a study that we've done. I want to talk through it. But if anyone here wants a free trial of our software, here's the information. You'll see this in the deck that you received. But I'm going to actually pull something up here that I'd like to go through with all of you. And you can see here on my screen, we did a study back in 2016 where we analyzed 10 million passwords from data breaches. And so when we analyzed the 10 million passwords from data breaches, what was really interesting was that if you look here to the left, the top 25 most commonly used passwords of 2016 that were subject to a data breach, the number 1 was 123456. The number 2 was through the number 9, and number 3, which is the framework of the traditional keyboard, right, that you type on, was QWERTY. And you can see here, just generally speaking, how weak these passwords are, right? We've seen this many times in data breaches where its password is actually the password that's used. And you can see here as I go through this list, what's important to understand is that number 1, hackers make a dictionary list of password lists like this. So they know that statistically, if you look at our research here, the top 25 passwords of 2016 represented over 50% of the 10 million that were analyzed. This list of 25 was used 50% of the time in the list of 10 million, which is staggering. So hackers in their software that they use to brute force attack your websites, they know that 50% of the time these passwords are commonly used, and they also know statistically that 60% of the time most people use the same passwords on the same website application and system. So this gives them a very high hit rate in terms of success. So this is an interesting study. And what we're seeing is that, for example, in the Ponemon study, is that password behavior is still at a point where it needs to be massively changed. It's just starting to gain traction in terms of people's behaviors, the understanding that technology exists, you know, for identity and access management and password management, which is a subset of IAM. And we work really hard in terms of educating the public about this problem. So as we talked about, you see here it says how to protect your passwords from getting hacked. And number 1 was use a variety of characters. So upper, lowercase, special characters, numbers, just to be random and high strength, and have minimum password lengths of 8 characters, avoiding dictionary terms. So that means do not use and avoid passwords that are on this list. And number 3, use a password manager, because a password manager is going to create a high strength random password for every single website and system that you use. It's going to remember them for you. It's going to rotate them for you over the course of a schedule that you select. And it's going to automatically log you in and fill them in to web forms and applications to speed things up, so that when you come to a website, you click a single button and it automatically fills the password and login credentials for you so that you don't have to manually reference password lists and type things in manually. So it makes life easier, and it puts a hyper level of security around that experience. So Jason, that is really the crux of my presentation today. So if anyone has any questions we could cover, just for the last 15 minutes, I'd be happy to answer some questions that any of our viewers and participants have today.
Of course. Let me go back through the questions panel and grab a couple of questions. And by the way, I just want to thank you for providing such informative content here on CPA Academy. Darren, it's a pleasure having you on the platform.
Oh, you're welcome. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun, and I love doing this. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Of course. Here's an interesting question. The user didn't provide their name, but the question is about Tor, and would you suggest using Tor or other such quote-unquote dark web browser in order to enhance your security?
And I would say that's not necessary. Yeah, so the Tor network is really used mainly for the dark web, and there's nothing really friendly, fast, or expeditious about it. It's just, it's not built out enough for traditional commerce. It's not common in terms of being used for traditional commerce. And the technology solutions that exist today, which are some that we've talked about, the way that they interface with existing browsers like IE, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Microsoft Edge, and even Opera are very powerful. And they will put a cloak of armor around that browsing experience. So there's really no reason to use the Tor browser. Technology, when it's overlaid the right way on the existing browsers, is very powerful.
All right, scrolling through, another user is asking, I am a one preparer in a sole proprietorship. I have 2 computers at 2 locations. What is the best way to get a security checkup for my business?
Well, I would recommend installing endpoint security software on all of those machines and a password management solution on all of those machines. On everything, all of the smartphones, tablets, computers. And most of those systems out there will cover, an unlimited number of devices, so they scale rapidly.
All right, let me go through. A lot of people are asking for information on secure password managers. Any comments?
I'm sorry, Jason, you said secure password. What was the last word?
Oh, password managers, secure password managers.
Well, I would say, this is like the equivalent of, not to be like the sound of one hand clapping, but I would say Keeper is a good place to start. We're zero knowledge security architecture is really important, and the entire solution is based off of that because it's extremely critical to make sure that the vendor you work with never has access to or knowledge of your master password or the encryption key that's used to encrypt and decrypt your information. So Keeper does not do any server-side encryption or decryption. All of the encryption is handled client-side at the device level. So we never have an ability to access or decrypt your information, and we don't know your master password because that's always encrypted and relegated at the device level, not on our servers. So I would start there, and you can do your own research and see what else is out there. But the application has a 4.9 out of 5, 5.0 rating. It's a very high rated application, and for the price, we're happy to work with anyone here who's interested in terms of making sure that they're taken care of today. And since they spend time with me, discounts are fine too. We price it, at a very, I think, a very value-driven price, but we're happy to help.
And we have Janice just dropped in the questions panel and said, we've used Keeper at our firm for a couple of years and it has helped our staff exponentially. Thank you, Janice. Let me go through. Lisa asked,
Thank you, Janice. Thank you.
Lisa asks, my one concern is what would stop a hacker from hacking my password manager itself?
So a good password manager, for instance, Keeper, has what's called self-destruct protection. So if a hacker gets, let's say you're at Starbucks, you're filling your coffee in the morning, you put your smartphone down, which happens a lot, by the way, that's why I'm using this example. You put the creamer in, you're stirring your coffee, somebody bumps into you, you look down, your smartphone's gone. And the smartphone is like the cash versus the piano syndrome, like in internal controls, we talk about that in accounting, right? It's a lot easier to steal a smartphone than it is to steal a grand piano. And since our lives and everything that we do is on that smartphone, you've got to protect it. So if I was a hacker and I go to the Keeper application, I have to log in with a master password and perhaps a fingerprint. So I'm only given 5 attempts to guess what her master password is. After the 5th attempt, Keeper self-destructs on that device. But we keep what's called an encrypted binary. It's an encrypted backup file of her vault in our cloud security vault. When she gets her device back or replaces that phone, she reinstalls Keeper, and within a matter of seconds, she can upload and decrypt her records and restore everything within seconds. So you want to make sure that if you're buying a password manager, it has self-destruct protection. And you can enable that in the settings. It's very granular in how you can set that up. You also want to make sure that it has an auto logout feature. So we can set auto logout, like for instance, my account, because I use Keeper like 20, 30 times a day because I have 700 records in my Keeper vault. I don't know what any of my passwords are. If I don't touch Keeper for 10 seconds, if I don't transact with it for 10 seconds, it automatically logs me out. So you can set your logout timer to 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, whatever you want. And therefore, if you walk away from your device, if you're called into a meeting and you're logged in the Keeper in your browser, it'll automatically after that, a lot of time log you out. So you've got really strong protection against, hackers on the system.
All right, here's another good one from Kelly. Kelly asks, if your password manager automatically populates passwords for your website, do I need to take additional security measures to protect my hardware? If my hardware is stolen and my passwords are populated automatically, it doesn't seem that the strength of the password would be relevant.
Actually, no, the strength of the password is extremely important because, for instance, if you use Keeper, you can autofill login credentials on desktop applications as well, not just on the internet. So you're going to create high-strength random passwords through using Keeper. You're going to click a dice symbol inside each of the records, and it's going to spin up a high-strength random password based on the policies that you set up for your firm. Now, you're going to do that and transact the same way that you do online with all of your native applications, whether it's on a mobile device or it's a desktop application like, for instance, your accounting software, right? So if you're logging into like Pro Series or Lacert or another, like a Pro System FX or anything like that, you're going to use the tools that come with Keeper to automatically do that for you. And it's a beautiful application in that respect. It just speeds things up and it's very secure.
All right, here is what looks like a spoofing question. Can there be an issue if you open an email that says, say, Citibank on it, but the email doesn't, but you don't open any links contained within that email, even when you can tell that the email is a forgery?
Yeah, so if you come across the email and you don't transact with it, meaning if you don't click any of the links like an executable file, or you don't, click something where it brings you to, potentially malicious website where you enter login credentials, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And if you've got, a good email system, it should flag, a lot of those errant emails for you. So you shouldn't see a lot of them. They still sneak their way through, but the email providers are getting better at rooting out phishing emails and spam. So, you're still going to get them, but I would always say just make sure that if you get an email from, for example, the IRS, who doesn't email, by the way, but people still fall for it. If you get an email from a bank, always look at the from to email address and confirm that it's actually from, for example, a citibank.com. And it's like almost instantaneous. If you look at the email address, you will know when it's malicious. It just won't make any sense. So
completely agree there. I jokingly used this example in another in a different webcast. If you get an email that has Google branding and the domain comes from @googlewebappmail.com, that's not from Google. Do not click on it.
absolutely.
And let me see if I can scroll through and find some more good questions. Edward asks, how do we recover former employees' files? Might be a little tricky.
Okay, so I'm not really sure if he's asking for data recovery, but if you're using Keeper, you have internal control. So you establish whether somebody can view a file, delete a file, anything that's contained in the Keeper vault, you have complete domain and control over it as the administrator. So if you've got a situation where somebody leaves your organization, you can lock their vault and transfer their vault to another person at the firm. So it's got really strong granular control. We call that data loss prevention. So it has really strong DLP characteristics.
And here, this might be the last one because we're running out of time. Adriano asks, is Keeper both a password manager and an encryption software?
Yes, it is.
All right, and we are just about at the end. We're getting real close to the end of our time. Oh, you know what? One last really good question came in from Michael. Let's see if we can answer this quickly. A security expert I heard on another webinar recently said that drive encryption can prevent ransomware attacks. Is that true?
It really depends in what framework that's being used, but I would say, there's some really good software out there for preventing, ransomware attacks, and I could list off 10 vendors. I don't typically do that on these, but in terms of the type of software, like we use one that's really popular here in our company, and it's installed on every single device that we have. But you shouldn't, and this is like a really important point, like you shouldn't be forced to use like something radically different than what you're used to. In other words, you shouldn't have to change like, the operating system on all of your devices, unless it's like, Windows 95 or something like that. But if you're using, some of the machines that have been sold over the past, let's say, upwards of 4 years ago, you're going to be fine, because good software vendors in technology, do a lot of regression testing like us. I mean, we test all the way back to like iPhone 5, for instance, right? And so you're talking about the software being, cross-functional on devices that might be, 6 years old. And so software should operate that way, and it should be, holistic, and it should cover, every type of OS out there. It should be platform and device wide, so that, it has, just a high level of agnostic characteristics with it. And so you want to use something that's OS and platform agnostic for sure.
All right, and with that, we are out of time. So Darren, if you have any concluding thoughts for the webinar, now is the time. And after that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up.
No additional thoughts other than I just want to thank everybody for participating. I think we had a really nice turnout today. It's been great and a lot of fun, and I hope, this was a helpful hour and a half for everybody.
I think it most certainly was. So I'll get into some end of webinar housekeeping. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you first, Darren, and to Linda, who's also been on the line with us from Keeper Security. Thank you both for your time today and for sharing your knowledge with our users here on CPA Academy. We're grateful to have you guys. Oh, and Mike shut up. Sorry about that. I was having some trouble with the microphone again. A little bit of end of webinar housekeeping for credit. Everyone who answered the poll questions, 3 out of 4, we will be issuing CPE credit by the end of the day today. That will be available in all of your accounts along with an archived recording of the webinar and a copy of the handouts. A big thanks again to Darren and everyone at Keeper Security for providing today's webinar and for sharing their knowledge with us. And big thanks to all of you on the line with us as well. Thank you for your continuing support, for your attendance. We hope you have a great rest of the day and hope to see you all on future webinars.